Hello there, welcome to the RetroSaber podcast, where we always take the high ground. Now, before we start this week's podcast, I am going to apologise in advance. I have got a little bit of a sore throat, little hint of a cough, so if you hear any of that coming through, I do apologise. Try and forgive me, I'm doing my best. Now, after last month's podcast, where I was joined by Razriz Retro, it was a completely different setup, had that fantastic back and forth. We are back to the solo riding podcast. And don't worry, I am going to do more podcasts with other people down the line. In fact, I've got a couple in mind, so stick with us for those. But what are we going to be talking about today? Well, as we're back to me rolling solo, I wanted to talk about something that I have a particular interest and experience of in gaming, which is remakes. So, what do we mean by a remake of a game? Obviously, there's lots of things that people could consider a remake, but I'm specifically talking about taking the original game. I don't mean a remaster like we've seen with the GTA trilogy, GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas recently. That was very much a touch-up, a few graphical tweaks. And I'm not talking about a director's cut where additional bits are added in or things like that. I am talking about a full, from the ground up remake of a game. And what I want to do is think about what makes a remake worthwhile, what makes a remake good value for us as gamers, and what kind of remake is the remake that we would consider more of a bit of a cash grab. Well, I suppose the first thing I need to do is maybe give some examples of good remakes. The easiest one for me to throw out there is Resident Evil, the 2002 remake of the original Resident Evil game. So what made this one a good remake? I suppose we're also, as we talk about this, going to answer what justifies making a remake. Maybe I'll ask that question first. What does justify a game being remade? Well, I suppose from the very start, the game has to have some love. The game has to be something that people have fond memories of. It has to be something that people are invested in. I mean, why would you remake something that people didn't really like when you could just make a new game? Even within that brand, you don't need to remake a game to be able to have the cash grab aspect. So there has to be something specific about it that people really enjoyed. But here's the clincher to it. There also has to be a reason to remake it. I mean, why can't people just play the original? Now, the easiest get out of jail free card for this is the graphics have aged. I don't necessarily buy that. I'm not saying changes in the graphics can't justify a remake, but graphics have aged on their own doesn't really work for me. But we can put graphics in there as a factor. Perhaps there is a problem with the gameplay, with the environment, with the content of the game. Something about it that, whilst people loved it, it was not quite right. The term I've used a lot is flawed masterpiece. Maybe it wasn't flawed at the time, but for modern gamers, maybe now it is. And this is where the original Resident Evil, which, in fairness, I am actually going to do a retro review of that game very, very soon. In fact, it's already made, but it will get posted after this video. And I've already done a retro review of the 2002 game, so feel free to check those two out together as a bit of an example of this. But the original Resident Evil, as great as it was, had some flaws to it. Certainly as other games came along, even the things it did well, comparatively now didn't look so good. We had the fact that at the time it used some dodgy cosplay looking actors in cutscenes, that the voice acting was really quite poor, that some of the levels, whilst beautiful, actually, very quickly as the second and third game came out, looked a little bit corny and dated. There's also the factor that games from that early PlayStation generation, the first PlayStation, and then games and graphics in 2002, as it was on the Nintendo GameCube, we're talking a couple of generations difference that made a massive difference. The way they were able to change the graphics for that game were starkly noticeable. There were flaws in playing the original Resident Evil game, and people then playing the new version that was released in 2002, you couldn't deny the massive improvements that had been made. It was still the same game. We still had that beautifully crafted story. The actual cutscenes even mirrored what happened in the original, but with actual really good CGI graphics and pretty damn good voice acting now as well. Maybe the standards just leapt up over a few years. But what was a really well-received game, the original Resident Evil, quickly became something that people looked at with a degree of, oh, bless. So when it was remade, it was justified, and it justified itself. For a start, this is also a game now being released on a Nintendo console. Well, Nintendo gamers had very little access to Resident Evil before. I think Resident Evil 2 was released on the Nintendo 64. But apart from that, this was a whole new world for Nintendo gamers. Maybe that's another reason that justifies the cost of buying a game, is that it's actually now available in this new format to a new audience. Either way, substantial, you cannot compare the graphical differences. There was tons of added content, but it still kept the actual story, but everything about it was improved. The aspect where you go to see Neptune, that big giant shark, goes from being a kind of embarrassing shark chasing you around a square room to this massive underground aquatic centre that is terrifying. It was just such an improvement. There's other games as well that maybe didn't make such massive leaps, but still found ways to justify the cost, such as Super Mario All-Stars. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what Super Mario All-Stars is, Super Mario All-Stars was basically a package that was released, a cartridge that was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System that had improved and updated remade versions of Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, and a bonus game, Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Now, we're talking one generation difference here from the NES to the SNES, so you would think that isn't quite justified. However, in my opinion, you'd be wrong. You see, whilst the leap between the 8-bit and 16-bit consoles wasn't as revolutionary as the 16-bit to the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStations and Xbox, it took everything that the 8-bit consoles did just about, and it did them with beautiful ease. When you look at the original Super Mario Bros., it has this really niche retro charm. When you look at Super Mario Bros. On the SNES, it is beautiful. Same with Super Mario Bros. 2 and especially Super Mario Bros. 3. Super Mario Bros. 3, at least in my opinion, when it was released on the NES, it was stretching the NES to its breaking point. It had beautiful, colourful graphics, but they were shaking and off-center and just looked like they were tearing the console apart to be able to do this. When that game was a part of that package on Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario All-Stars, it looked flawless. It looked like a beautiful animation all the way through. The sound, the graphics, these weren't touch-ups. This was rebuilt from the ground up. They didn't really add anything to the individual games. But the fact that they put all 3 of those games on one package, one cartridge, and then you add the Lost Levels, which for Japanese audiences is what they called Super Mario Bros. 2. But for Western audiences, we'd never played that before, and granted, once we did play it, it gave us nightmares, and we probably wish we'd never played it because it was so damn hard. But it still introduced us to something new, something we'd never played before. These 4 games put on one cartridge for the price of one game. You're getting 4 games for one game. The justification comes in the value, plus the beautiful improvement between one generation to the next, mixed with that value, made it worthwhile, made it a remake that was justified. So what have we come up with so far? What justifies these remakes? Well, so far we've established that the game itself, the original games, have to be beloved. There has to have been something about it that was either flawed at the time, and we still loved it despite that flaw, or there had to be something that over time has not really kept us, something that hasn't stood the test of time. It's aged poorly very quickly. It also has to be worth paying for again. Now, I expect these to be a game built from the ground up, but as generations have gone on, a big part of a game is the storyline, the dialogue. That wasn't really a factor back with the Super Mario Bros. Games. That wasn't a factor with Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, but with games like Resident Evil it is. As we work through other generations of games, Grand Theft Auto, Assassin's Creed, they have true stories and dialogue and scripts that need to be written. So that becomes a part of it. So if we're keeping that effectively, that's one less thing they have to do. So why am I paying the same amount again? Or, to be honest, usually much more. There has to be that value reason for it. So when isn't it justified? Well, let's be honest, this is a matter of opinion. And it is even opinion that may change from one game to the next. For example, I was a huge fan of GoldenEye 007, the Nintendo 64 classic. They have kind of remade that, but it wasn't effective because it never captured the same feelings that the original did. Now, it was justified to be remade. It was absolutely justified to be remade because as much as many of us hate to acknowledge this, if you go back and play that game now, the controls are terrible. They weren't at the time. Maybe we've got accustomed to just games controls getting better and better, and now we go and play that, it's problematic at best. And so I was all for them making that, but what I wanted the game to be was improved graphics, but the same levels, slightly tightened gameplay. But we didn't get that. So for me, that wasn't worthwhile. But another one of my favourite games ever is Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. KOTOR, as many people refer to it as. That game was brilliant, and the main thing I loved about it was the story, the exploration of the galaxy, the characters, the interweaving of the characters. I didn't really like the gameplay very much. Not because the gameplay was bad, because it was that turn-based combat system where it's almost that, let's see how many points this is going to take off them. I don't like that. I've never liked that type of game. But I played it because I loved everything else about it so much that I could work through that. So when there'd been recent talk, which seems to have gone off a cliff now, unfortunately, of them remaking that game, I had two sides. Part of me was like, they better not change the story. Darth Revan and his background, I won't give spoilers here, that has to stay the same. By God, don't mess with that. The interactions with the other characters, the planets we explore, they can add some bits to it if they want, but they can't take any of that away. They can't change it. I don't want my expectations subverted. I don't want, ooh, plot twist. No, leave it as it is because it was perfect for me. But then there's the gameplay. Now, for a lot of other people, they might think, don't mess around with that gameplay. That gameplay was perfect. And I can see what they mean because so many people love that style of game and that gameplay did it really well. At least I'm assuming it did because everyone who likes that seems to like that game. It won so many awards. But if they told me they were going to change it to a slightly more open world adventure action game, but with the same stories and interactions, I'd be all for that. But other people wouldn't. So there is an element of personal preferences. I suppose what it comes down to is, what was it we loved about the original game? And what was it that we personally didn't? What for me justifies a remake might not for you. And that's okay. Everyone's entitled to their own perspectives and opinions on these things. But when these people are rolling the dice at making this remake of a game, they have to look across the board and go, what is going to give us the old fans, but is also going to make it accessible and enjoyable for new fans? And this is where we come on to a franchise that I've already touched on and I am a massive fan of, and that is Resident Evil. I was absolutely enamoured by the remake of the original Resident Evil. And when I found out that they were going to make a remake of Resident Evil 2, I was equally as excited. I hadn't really been as much of a fan as the Resident Evil games from 6 onwards. I loved Resident Evil 4, as we'll talk about very, very soon. And I was okay with Resident Evil 5, even if it took it too far away from what I loved about Resident Evil. I enjoyed the game. I didn't enjoy it as much as a Resident Evil game. That would be my way of looking at it. When they said they were going to remake Resident Evil 2, I thought, yeah, absolutely. This is a game that came out on the original PlayStation, on the Nintendo 64, and stretched the console to its limits then. If we can improve those graphics, add a little bit more to it, exactly like they did with the remake of Resident Evil in 2002, this is a winner. Absolute winner. They didn't do that. They didn't do that at all. They added quite a lot and changed the story. And more importantly, they completely changed the gameplay style. Whereas the remake of Resident Evil in 2002 stuck with that fixed screen perspective that the character walks around, that increases the tension, and you never know what's going to be around the corner until it's too late. This went with a generally over-the-shoulder perspective for a lot of the scenes, and that just took a lot away from me. And it was clear that they realised that was going to take away some of the tension. So how did they increase the tension? They made it, in some areas, so dark that you can't see a damn thing. So you have to use a torch to kind of see. Now, for a lot of people, because I know how successful that game was, for a lot of people that worked absolutely successful. Great. Good for you. I am very happy that you have a version of a Resident Evil game that you love and are happy with. No problem with that. But for me, it had the opportunity to be for Resident Evil 2 what the 2002 game was for Resident Evil 1. And it didn't do that. It remade it. Now, hypocritical here, because that's exactly what I've just said I would have liked in Knights of the Old Republic. So, how can I sit here and say they shouldn't have done that? I can't. Because let's be honest, a lot of people really struggled with the original Resident Evil games and that fixed camera perspective. As time's gone on, games have generally made themselves easier access. More, look, just here you go. Not saying easier, but yes, they have become easier. But also easier to engage with. Whereas the original Resident Evil games, you had to earn it. You had to sort of adjust to that type of game. They don't want that anymore. They want people to be able to pick up and just get into it. And it loses something for me. But fine. Regardless of whether it worked for me, it still worked as a game. And it was still justified. Let me be very clear. Because as much as the graphics from Resident Evil 2 are still really cool, they are cool for a PlayStation 1. We are, what, now 4 generations on from that? And graphics do change a lot over that period of time. But then we have Resident Evil 4. Now, again, let me preface this by saying if you have got and played the new remake of Resident Evil 4 and you are loving it and living your best life, I have nothing but joy for you. I am really glad you're enjoying it because it's a really good story. I'm sure this remake is a really good game. Here is my opinion, though. There was no reason, no need at all to remake Resident Evil 4. Now, why? Well, okay, let's nail this down. The reason for remaking Resident Evil 2, as I understood it, I'm not saying I have inside information, but what I can imagine it to be is that the graphics have aged a lot. Yeah, that is true. And the gameplay style of that game just wasn't for everybody. It took me a long time to get into it. Resident Evil 4, the gameplay's the same. Maybe there's some mild tweaks to the controls. Maybe there's some scenes that were a little bit tricky and they've made them a touch more responsive. But it's the same gameplay style. By this point, Resident Evil games had moved to that over-the-shoulder, sort of more action-based type game. So we can't really say it's because of that. In fact, Resident Evil 4 was still being released on consoles just in the last generation. Ever so slight remasters. No real changes to the graphics. But it still stood up perfectly well. That's how good it was. The other factor is graphics. And this is going to become more and more of a thing now. You see, the graphical leap between 8-bit and 16-bit consoles was effectively going, we've managed to do this, and we have perfected this to the point of art. It was usually the same style of thing, but the difference in how perfectly it was done was massive. Then the leap up to 32 and 64-bit consoles. From that point on, it was, look, we got 3D now. We're open world 3D games, much better sound, even video footage at some occasions. Okay. Within a couple more generations of console, by the time we reached consoles like the GameCube, the PS2, the PS3, the Xbox 360, those leap ups. Or leaps up? Leap ups? I don't know. Anyway, we were starting to reach a point where from one generation to the next, graphical improvements, and I'm not talking about how smooth something looks or frame rate or how big the world can be. I understand the memory and size of a game can be much bigger now. But actual graphical improvements? Not really. Not really. I've got a PlayStation 5 and I love my PlayStation 5. I'm not saying a bad word about it. But I've not really played a game on that makes me see it as an entire generational leap up from the PlayStation 4. I'm just not. So graphics being a justifiable reason, hell, I'm playing games like the remake of Resident Evil. Like Resident Evil 4, these were GameCube games. And I play them, and then I play some games on the PlayStation 4 and 5. I don't see massive changes between them. I don't. So graphics is not a justification for remakes now as it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. Back then it absolutely was. Now we can leap up 2 generations of console and there isn't really that much difference graphically. Again, size of game, yes, I totally accept that. But visuals, audio, not much. Not really. I think remakes run the risk now of becoming an easy way to cash in on a game. And as games become so overpriced now, that starts to feel a little bit lazy, a little bit cheeky, and a bit greedy. We do love our video games, and we need them to play well. But we also love the stories, we love the characters, and if they can take that entire aspect of it, and it's already done from a pre-existing game, it should come in a package, or it needs to be so revolutionary that it's justified. And I hope we see less remakes of games from the past 2 or 3 generations. If they want to make a remake of a game that was on an 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, maybe 64-bit console, I am all for that. If they want to make Super Mario 64 redone, and I don't mean the little crappy version they did for the Nintendo DS, where they just added the characters in and made it quote-unquote 3D. That was abysmal. But if they actually wanted to remake that with really beautiful graphics and put it in a package with something else, they recently did do for the Nintendo Switch Super Mario 64, Sunshine and Galaxy on a bumper package. No problem with that, but that was not a remake, it was a re-release. Because all 3 of those games were completely unaltered, right? Might have been a remastering to make it so that it didn't glitch, or the angles and stuff, but they weren't improved really. Not that I necessarily think Sunshine or Galaxy needs an improvement, but Mario 64, if they wanted to improve it and release it as a budget title, go for it. That'd be brilliant. I've got no problem with that. But anything from a later date than that, I just don't see the justification for improving it. It either was not very good, very poorly made, in which case, just make a new game. Or it was very well made, and you're just trying to cash in on it with slightly improved graphics, maybe. I don't know. There's no one answer to this. There's no 10 answers to this. It's a matter of opinion. When we love a game, how we would want it to be remade, if we would want it to be remade, becomes very personalised. Hell, especially for people like myself who, whilst I play modern games a lot, I'm also what I consider myself to be a fan of retro gaming. So maybe there's an element in that makes me biased. Maybe I don't want those precious things to be touched. I don't think that's too much the case, because I've already spoken about certain retro games that I would love to see be remade. I recently did a review for Jedi Knight Jedi Academy and talked about what a brilliant game it was, with a great story and great audio, great exploration, great characters, and talked about how it being one of the original sort of Xbox releases, I think also on the PC, that the graphics could be massively improved, and especially things like camera angles and controls. And I'd love to have seen that be remade. It won't, because of Disney's ownership over Star Wars. So they're not going to make games that have a canon outside of their own. I digress. But there are games I would like to see be remade, but that doesn't mean that everyone else has to look at it the same way as me. I suppose the question comes back down then. What justifies a remake? And when is a remake just not required and not needed? There isn't actually an answer. There's an answer for the company that makes it. And for them it comes down to, will it be successful? Will it make money? Because there can be no other answer. They're not artists. As much as we like to think of video game designers as, caring about their craft and their passion, it's their job. It's how they make their money. And that's the cold, hard truth to it. They may love the game they make, but they'd love it to be successful more. In the end, it doesn't matter whether I want a game to be remade. It doesn't matter if you want a game to be made. We're going to differ on how we'd want it to change. The only thing that justifies a remake is if it makes money. That's the simple answer. And I don't like that answer. I suppose what we then need to think about is, every time we fork out a game, we're justifying it. I actually used to still buy some of the Resident Evil games, even if I didn't want them or like the fact they'd been remade, for completion's sake. And in the end, I stopped buying them because I didn't want to justify them making that same game when they could have done something different. And at the same time, if you do like it and you do want to see them do more of that, you're well within your rights to buy it. If you think that soon they should be doing a remake of Resident Evil 5 from the Xbox 360 with graphics that for me would still stand up today, but you want a slightly improved version of that, go and buy Resident Evil 4, the remake, because that's what it'll tell them, that they should do Resident Evil 5. And by the way, you're not wrong. Neither am I in saying that they shouldn't. It's a personal preference. It's a matter of opinion. And I suppose the original still exists out there for all these games. I guess for retro gamers, one of the problems with remakes is that it stops people from looking back to the past. It stops people from exploring the original. Maybe it stops people from being retro gamers. Maybe that's the concern for me sometimes, is when I hear younger generations talking about, I've played the new Resident Evil game, it's really good. And I know if they go back and play the original now, they won't like it as much. Whereas at some point, they might have gone back and played Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and found something in it they loved if they put the time in. Maybe Remake's biggest flaw is that it has the potential to kill off retro gaming. But then, maybe that's a risk anyway. Maybe retro gaming, as we move towards games all being online, and each generation just having an online shop where you can stream these games, but you never own them. The moment that game gets cancelled for something that's considered politically incorrect or offensive, you will never have access to it again, unless you own physical media. Which is why I love physical media and hate the idea of just having downloads of everything. So maybe retro gaming is on the way out anyway, and these remakes, maybe that's a way for them to live on. Who knows? It's a matter of opinion. But then we know what opinions are like. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this. I for those who have listened throughout my entire ramble on this, I really appreciate it. Let me know below. Comment below if you have the time. What's your favourite remake of a game? And maybe let me know, what do you think justifies a remake? What do you think makes something absolutely untouchable that it should never be remade or re-looked at in that way. Either way, it's a matter of opinion. I'll respect yours, and I'm sure you'll respect mine. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you all, as always. I am going to be doing another one of these soon. Whether the next one will be me riding solo or being joined by someone else, we'll have to wait and see. But either way, thank you for spending your time with me. Thank you for listening to the RetroSaber podcast and putting up with my dodgy throat. And until next time, take the high ground.